Climate change to become an ever more powerful cause of migration. Climate change is wreaking havoc on the world's diverse species, biosystems and socio-economic fabric. The mass movement of desperate people will become more common, and deaths from serious diseases in the world's poorest countries will rise.
And how do we responsibly capture that multi-causal nature of population movements in a way that policymakers can understand?
And seeing, the limitations on mobility. So people who move short distances or only move to certain places, and who are trapped in transit, as we,
And our house was underwater. Yeah. We had to migrate. And that was my experience myself. We had to move to another house.
Decades of devastating activity. The third largest mangrove ecosystem in the world.
Zimbabwe is supposed to have this rainy season, sort of November, December, January time going on to February. But none of that has happened.
While we deal with statistics, with figures, we don't always remember the human consequences, the people themselves.
I have to do something about it, and the way that I can do it is by my film.
The equation of carbon emissions with the discredited simply says, look, these are both things. They're worse than junk bonds. They're just nothing. There's nothing you want in them.
Having the International Conference on Climate Change and Migration alongside the art exhibition not only gave it some weight, but also added a critical rigour to the work and how we visualise the issues around it. Unknown to most people, climate change is going to be adding a pretty significant push for people to abandon their homes and to be migrating on a fairly staggering scale.
Change our weather patterns.
Climate change, as well as migration, are both very densely populated by lots of saturated media bombardment, really, lots of imagery that we get all the time. And one of the things is for art to be able to sort of help people re-engage in a different way with those images.
The art exhibition for us was a way of bringing some of the themes of the conference to the wider public, but also to invite the conference goers to think aesthetically about their object of research.
What strikes me at this conference really is the diversity of the approaches and of the papers. 10 or 8 years ago, most of the papers were case studies investigating the causes of migration. That is, what kind of environmental drivers are leading people to migrate and how do they migrate. And now we have papers reflecting on gender, on the consequences of migration, on the policy responses, much more on the legal frameworks, but also, and that's interesting, the appearance of critical papers trying to theorize this, to put this in the framework of post-colonial studies, for example, or of gender studies. And I would say that to me this is a new aspect, the new theorization of this field.
If climate change or other factors then force you to move, where would you go? How would you make that decision? Who's going to pay? These are the questions that we need to know from the people's perspective.
And lower rainfall have combined to reduce water flow by up to 40 kilometers of groundwater, with only 0.3% of fresh water being found in rivers. However, there is need for innovation.
And so this exhibition is about trying to see how art can engage and utilise those images, utilise documentary footage, utilise first-hand witness footage, and incorporate that into artistic processes so it's represented to audiences in a very different way, and in a way where we lose that little gloss or that separation that we always maintain between ourselves and those realities, those images that we're so used to seeing.
The content's been really, really thought-provoking, and I think for many of our visitors has perhaps raised questions about connections between migration, climate change, and perhaps whether there is anything which we can do to address these issues. So I think in terms of provoking thought and hopefully provoking action, it's been a really exciting project to be involved with.
Each of the exhibits, each of the installations was an invitation to the viewer to think about migration and climate change for perhaps the first time, and to think about climate and migration not as something to fear, but as a human experience.
We've been working on a long-term story on the river Brahmaputra. At various stages of the river, we came across erosion and what it meant to people, how it displaced people. And the bulk of the work that's being shown is from an island called Nijumdeep, which literally translates into the island of silence. It's one of the most remote islands in the Bay of Bengal, and an island that is very vulnerable for various reasons. It had also been ravaged by a recent cyclone. And when we arrived, we came across people who'd set up temporary homes, having been initially washed away from their homes because of erosion, then their homes having been destroyed because of the cyclone, and then facing yet another cyclone.
What was good about these photographs that I have seen, many of those faces, and they're real people, and their expression, is so real. You can feel. So and then our respondent, what we thought that the first thing we came that these people, they always fight on. They don't give up, and that really inspired us. So we need to show their resilience. So that's why we use some green leaves in a plastic bottle. That plastic bottle was like a symbol of the consumer society.
Consumer society. Actually, those plastic bottles in Asia, Bangladesh, India, they actually used so many times, recycled. The families actually live on those sort of things. They earn money by recycling stuff, and at the same time they are in the bottle. Recycled them life in there, but they're still fighting. They're still, living their life, doing their jobs.
Their life is sort of trapped by the consumer society their behavior, and but they still fight on, and they carry on with their lives.
I mean, the impact of the flood were so bad also because of the fact because there is big deforestation in this area.
Their ability to kind of grow their own food is also gone. So in a sense, they've become this almost a kind of a neoliberal kind of parody. They move straight.
The content of the conference was really important for my work within civil society, because you can't do activism, you can't do campaigning without political theory, because you have to understand what it is that you're advocating for, and you have to understand the political institutions and structures that might be preventing that from happening. So without theory, without political theory, you're basically doing activism in the dark.
Migration happens, so our responsibility as this community is to help governments and institutions find ways to make sure that if people move, that they do so in safety and dignity.
10 years ago, it was still very much a niche, environmental migration, and now it's really a kind of mainstream issue in the way we think about the interactions between the humans and their environment.
You are on the field, things are happening. I mean, it comes from different perceptions.
So the conference was really about trying to open up the debate, allowing new voices into the debate, the voices that might not otherwise get heard as within the academic discussion. So that was really the intention.
When you hear so many narratives and voices and research work, it gives you several insights. There's a birth of many insights in you, and you're being influenced and inspired by those ideas.
The term environmental refugee was coined in 1985 when empires exploded onto the world and colonies and empires were created. The claim of indigenous peoples.
But the loss and damage question is, what about the impacts that we can neither prevent or adapt to? So the kind of issues, the kind of destruction that there is really no way of us stopping and no way of us adapting to. So that's a huge question. And what we were looking at today was what kind of responsibilities does that create for the high emitting countries, so the countries that are firstly responsible for most of the emissions but also are wealthier.
Neoliberal rationality, proliferating global slums and refugee camps, including those populated by so-called climate refugees.
The question that we invited people to consider was really a question about power. Who has the power to define the terms of the debate? Who has the power to decide upon what types of knowledge are considered to be legitimate within the context of the debate?
Some projects undertaken to mitigate the effects of climate change may in effect displace people by forcing them to.
These 3 days I've been exposed to all sort of, presentation, theory of migration. I've seen, artists also, doing their own bit in relation to migration. So for me, all these are multidisciplinary experiences which I think will guide my work.
A lot of the times people have heard just different ways of how migration and climate change have been put across and all that, but sometimes it's easier to look at a picture or to hear a poem or to hear a song talking about migration or climate change, whatever, instead of just the normal sitting in an auditorium and listening to some scientist going on and on and on about terminology that you've got no idea of. So as artists, I think it's our duty and responsibility more than anything to create work that resonates with people, that people can understand.
The poetic sensibility that we're threaded through would provide that space for feeling, which sometimes a lecture format can't allow, because certainly in a Eurocentric tradition of lecturing, the idea is that you relate to the information, you engage your cognitive faculties. Of course, there are many people who break those rules of all hues and all backgrounds, but there is a risk of appealing to the rational, the cognitive, over the whole body, over the lived experience of those facts.
One of my key concerns, both as an artist and a journalist and an activist, when trying to tell stories of the subaltern, is that their stories almost invariably get reduced to numbers. Statistics are how we describe them. Figures, reports are how they're depicted. Very rarely are they personal stories. Very rarely do they talk about individual human beings, their passions, their beliefs, their emotions.
She employed shrewd business practices, such as buying clothes and utensils from towns nearby to pay people who work in her field with it.
We kind of came up with the idea of using Nigel Hewlett's films that I'd watched before. I mean, the films literally took me back, because some of the things that the people that were being interviewed were saying, I knew exactly what they were talking about. The whole idea of how the rainy seasons have changed, how certain fruits that used to grow on certain trees aren't there anymore. Those trees don't exist anymore. Whereby sometimes fruit is supposed to grow at a certain season, it doesn't grow in that particular season, and the heat is absolutely unbearable. I know that Zimbabwe has been going through a drought now for quite a while, and because rain has just not been available, it's just not come down when it's supposed to be, because Zimbabwe is supposed to have this rainy season sort of November, December, January time going on to February. but none of that has happened. So that just shows you how much change has happened, with the climate, and people are aware of this. They might not know what it's called, but they've been totally aware that things aren't the way they used to be. So for me, that really struck a chord with me, because I know exactly what they talk about. I grew up in the rural areas, and the stuff that they're talking of, I know. What I ended up doing was projecting Nigel's films onto a canvas through a projector and filming them on an iPad. So as I was painting, or rather responding to the images that were being projected, the iPad was filming me as I'm creating that work.
And traditional knowledge are slowly disappearing.
We started with a research that we had called the Moving Story. It was a report in terms of the impact that flood and climate change had in their life, and the difficulty that they were facing because of those kind of problems. I did some research about the kind of media archive that it's out there on internet. You can see it's not like a television report or something. It's something that people, just filmed because it was happening in that moment. And I used these kind of footage, some of them, crossing with the interviews that we had with 3 actors.
There was water of about 2 to 3 feet.
We did not know how to escape.
You hear these stories, and then this footage just hit you, like the way that flood fit in without any, precaution. And I tried to show that because it's exactly the way that it is. It's like you are sitting in your home, as you hear in these stories. You are sitting in your house, or you were sleeping, and suddenly flood started. Suddenly you couldn't go downstairs because of the level of water that you had in your house or around you. My own installation, Chamada from Chico Mendes, and there are a range of voices. Different artists and filmmakers contributed that footage consciously towards the project, and so the piece itself creates an interface or a playback system for people to be able to view that different kind of, all those different bits of footage.
Knowing full well that we're going to have serious problems with regards to food.
It provides a very playful way, using musical hitting and instruments and objects related to how we consume carbon emitting products, and people can hit those products and objects and actually influence the way the footage plays back within this kind of mask, this humanized mask.
The Chico Mendes homage in the Durham Art Gallery, and again I just thought this is just so good. A white cube space which you'd made interactive. It was very unusual. I mean, to be able to make sounds that change images, it was very engaging. It probably allowed, I would imagine, a lot of new people to enter into these kinds of questions who might not have done, because you used very, very creative thinking in the putting together that installation.
The 8 Ogoni leaders who are executed with Kenserewa, there's the polluted environment.
The fact that in Ogoni land, which at its height probably had 700,000 inhabitants. It's a very small place. But actually very few people can live there now because people can't subsist. So most people have to live in Port Harcourt. And the campaign is to restitute the land, to rehabilitate the land, to enable people to move back from Port Harcourt and elsewhere to Ogoni land and to start their lives again. And then there was the 20th anniversary since the executions of Ken Saro-Wiwa and the Ogoni 8, who had been protesting against Shell and Chevron's devastating activities in the Niger Delta, and who were murdered in 1995 by the Nigerian government. I approached Cy Murray, who's a performance poet and activist, and said, look, there's something we can do here to create an engagement through artistic process plus factual information that could engage the audience in a new way. We should try and do something that isn't a lecture, that isn't a performance, that is somewhere between. And the other poetry piece was a video made of poet Selina Nwulu called Home is a Hostile Lover. Selina's poem was very much looking at the impossibility of living in anywhere called home if you've been displaced, if you've been violated. And she connected to the migrations crossing the Mediterranean. She connected to her own experience as a sort of first generation British born woman of Nigerian parents.
The ocean leaves its offcuts when sated, and I am left a half-lit emblem.
Yeah, and we also presented a really important film called Exit by Dilla, Scofidio and Renfro. They were commissioned some years back by the Cartier Foundation to produce a piece of work based on a lot of climate change data and migration data. That was originally created as a kind of large-scale immersive video installation, and we represented that as a film. Exit is strangely evocative, using the soundtrack and show a global map with a number of different movements and patterns and representations of the statistics, and somehow the soundtrack creates this evocation of people's movements and the humanity underneath those statistics.
It's got to be a discussion about race, class and power when you talk about the environment. It falls unequally. Just as in Tower Hamlets across the road has the most disproportionate levels of asthma and lung conditions, and yet the lowest car ownership in London.
It wasn't your typical polar bears in the snow, or, you know, the general stuff that you'd normally get about climate change, or even migration at that. So you didn't get pictures of or photographs of people in hordes and hordes, you know, migrating through from one place to another place.
And people who kind of come to visit those places even, not just particularly for seeing the exhibition or this, you know, artworks. You could see different kind of people, different kind of age, different kind of background.
But I think it's been a really, really exciting project which crosses boundaries between arts and sciences and social sciences, and also works really, really, really well in terms of bringing in completely new audiences.
The projected images in the Oriental Museum, beautiful, large format projected images of people going about their daily lives, for example, in Bangladesh. You know, presenting to us in large format the humanity of the other, as it were. That's a really profound thing, I think, for people. And when they're invited to look at an image like that as, you know, an image of climate change, for example, I think it really shifts the way that people think about climate change. It says climate change is not a technical issue. It's not a, you know, an obscure policy or legal issue, but it's a human issue, and it involves the lives of people. And I think that's partly what the art exhibition was trying to bring to people's attention.
I wanted to really push the diversity and the plurality of who was creating the artwork, the levels at which they were creating it, where they're from, the geographical and cultural regions that they're from and that they kind of represent, and the kind of cultural background that informs their way of thinking. I wanted to diversify and pluralize the kinds of places where it was shown, the different kinds of people who would be participating in showing it or in the events. I wanted to have a range of different ways in which people could come into the dialogues that the arts presents. So we had a lot of discussion sessions, a really wide range of discussion discussion sessions in different venues. The project had 3 exhibition spaces: the Oriental Museum, Durham Art Gallery and the Miners' Hall. The Miners' Hall is the historical centre for the Durham Miners Association, which is an incredible context and audience for the work. We had Dave Douglas, a really interesting ex-miner and trade unionist who collaborated with us in a discussion event where he was bringing in class and miners' issues.
And people from the coal communities have started coming back and defending that history and their roots.
We also used Durham University for the public screening of the exit film. And then there was the artist-run space known as Empty Shop, used for Platform's performance night. We had a pretty strong collaboration with local environmentalists from Transition Durham, who did a mini event as a part of the Platform performance at Empty Shop, looking at issues of divestment from fossil fuels. That involved a film screening with discussion and poetry.
Provide a platform on which to force the issue.
Another session unpacked the can of worms that is art and activism. That panel involved the cultural critic and researcher Janet Stewart from the Centre for Visual Arts and Culture in Durham.
Voices into a particular situation, and we've seen a really lovely example of how.
And then, of course, we had a panel where the artists themselves looked at the process, the aesthetics, and the politics within their own
whatever
work.
they need to do and go back and uplift their countries.
Being part of this exhibition is quite exciting for me. This is a wonderfully eclectic show with people from various parts of the globe with different art practices being combined. More importantly, I think it is important that these individual acts of resistance be seen as part of a much wider movement towards social equality, and that we begin to work collectively, because these issues are not unique to Bangladesh. I mean, they will be present in different forms, in different reincarnations, in different places. But at the end of the day, it's this human fabric and the vulnerability of some of us that is what this story is about. And I think a show such as this begins to make those connections.
Thank you.